Welcome back. Last time we discussed why the Qur'an is not fully translatable into another language. Keeping this in mind, the first attempt to translate the Qur'an was into Persian 1100 years ago, and the first English translation goes back to the 17th century. Today, the best English translation is the Study Qur'an, which you've already read certain surahs or chapters of. The advantage of the Study Qur'an is not only its translation, but its wonderful introductions to each surah, and summary of Qur'anic commentaries on verses from over 40 commentaries representing various historical, linguistic, theological, philosophical, and mystical perspectives, as well as a large number of essays at the end of the book dealing separately with major themes contained in the Qur'an. These include the Qur'an and Islamic law, the Qur'an and Islamic theology and philosophy, the Qur'an and Sufism, the Qur'an and Islamic art, conquest and conversion, war and peace in the Qur'an, and death, dying, and the afterlife in the Qur'an. There's also a wonderful appendix on the timeline of major events related to the Qur'an with beautiful maps illustrating the relations between them. I can't recommend the Study Qur'an highly enough. So with this in mind, what is the structure of the Qur'an? It's a book of over 6,000 ayat, which literally means symbols, but is here translated as verses, and 114 surahs or chapters. The order in which they appear was arranged at the direction of the Prophet under divine inspiration. They are not arranged according to the chronology of revelation. The Qur'an begins with the chapter called the opening, Al-Fatiha, which is really the foundation of the Qur'an. After that, the chapters are arranged in descending order of length. That is, the longest chapter of the Qur'an is chapter 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, and then Al-Imran, which is slightly shorter, until you get to the last chapters, which are all very short. In some cases, a chapter is slightly longer than the preceding one, but only by a couple of lines or a couple of words. There are two types of chapters or verses in the Qur'an, the Meccan and the Medinan, depending on where the verse was revealed. These cover the two parts of the life of the Prophet. The Meccan surahs deal primarily with Ihsan and Iman, while the Medinan surahs also deal with Islam. It's interesting to note that less than 4% of the verses of the Qur'an deal with Islamic law, while the rest deal with everything from morals to metaphysics. One of the sciences of the Qur'an deals with the condition under which a verse was revealed and when it was revealed, which the Study Qur'an covers in great detail. As the Qur'an was recited to the community by the Prophet, it was memorized by a large number of his companions. The Arabs at that time had a prodigious memory because they were mostly nomads and were known for transmitting their knowledge and history through the oral tradition. Even today, the few nomads who are left in Africa or Arabia could no doubt outshine PhD students from the best universities in terms of their memories. That's because while modern schooling often dulls the memory, traditional schooling always emphasized the art of memory. And so the strength of the oral tradition of the Arabs at the time of the Quranic revelation was a crucial factor in the transmission of the Qur'an. Still today, throughout the Islamic world, there are people who have memorized the entire Qur'an. Such a person is called a Hafiz. The greatest poet of the Persian language, Hafiz, is so named because he was a person who knew the whole of the Qur'an by heart. The time came when, after the death of the Prophet, those who knew the Qur'an by heart gradually began to die. But according to Islamic tradition, 2 copies of the Qur'an had been written down in his lifetime. One copy was recorded by Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet, and one by Zayd ibn Thabit. During the Caliphate of Uthman, the third caliph, which lasted from 644 to 656, Uthman brought together the 2 written versions, along with all the people who knew the Qur'an by heart, many having learned it directly from the Prophet. Working together, they made certain that all the verses matched each other. Then the definitive text was copied, 4 copies of it were sent to the 4 directions of the Islamic world, and a 5th copy was kept in Medina itself. That Qur'an is the Qur'an which all Muslims follow. There is only one version of the Qur'an. There are no differences in the text. Absolutely none. It is said that the eloquence of the Qur'an is in itself a miracle. For an Arabic speaker to hear or read the beauty woven into the use of the language itself is a profound and deeply moving experience. This is not a clever or even inspired posing of words, but the very highest use of language that conveys meaning of deep significance. In this, while being what one would call poetic, it transcends the concept of poetry. It must be remembered that the Qur'an has many levels of meaning, from the outward to the inward. That multiple levels exist can be attributed to the sweeping themes contained inside, but also to the remarkable richness of the language used. Countless Qur'anic commentaries have been written over the centuries from both the inner and outer viewpoints. It is said that the highest level is known only to God. The Qur'an has several major themes. Most importantly, it speaks of the divine presence, the divine reality in the world. In this sense, it is called Al-Qur'an, as we saw earlier, the recitation. As the book of knowledge, it speaks extensively about the natural world and contains the roots of knowledge. The Qur'an speaks more about the world of nature than any other sacred text, with the possible exception of the Tao Te Ching. The Qur'an is the al-Kitab. It also speaks about the Day of Judgment, the end of this world, paradise, and other eschatological events, more than the Bible and the Torah, perhaps because it's the final revelation before the end of this cycle of creation, according to Islam. The Qur'an is also a book of ethics and divine law, the Sharia. It sets out laws for both the individual and society, which we shall return to when we discuss Islamic law in more detail. This concludes our discussion of the Qur'an. Next, we'll turn to the Prophet of Islam and his sayings, which also serve as a foundation for all 3 dimensions.